Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Thanks, John, and good morning to everyone. I wanted to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. As John said, Think JSOU is an ongoing program that explores research and publications of leading academics and the wider SOF and international security communities, as well as our own JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, and the diverse voices and experiences of the global-wide community of SOF professionals. The online collection of Think JSOU webinars includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. These captures also inform our ongoing re-examinations of existing JSOU SOF unique education, leader preparation, and development curricula, as well as inspires innovative new research and the uncovering of new knowledge. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the Strategic Studies Department and our JSOU social media sites. Today, Dr. Susan Bryant joins us to discuss civil-military relations and the impact that the all-volunteer military has had on Americans' perceptions of the U.S. military, both from the American public and military internal perspectives. Dr. Bryant is a retired Army colonel and the executive director of Strategic Education International, an educational nonprofit that designs and delivers executive education programs for governments and private industry. She also teaches grand strategy and military history at Georgetown University, as well as defense policymaking at Johns Hopkins, and is also a visiting research fellow at the National Defense University. Dr. Bryant is the co-author of From Citizen Soldier to Secular Saint, The Societal Implications of Military Exceptionalism, which is the foundational research for our discussion today. And she is also the co-author of Finding Ender, Exploring the Intersections of Creativity, Innovation, and Talent Management in the U.S. Armed Forces, which is useful research for exploring how the U.S. military must use creativity and innovation to remain competitive in today's international arena. Good morning, Dr. Bryant, and thank you for agreeing to sit with us for this fascinating discussion on our current state of the military.
Got to find my unmute button. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to talk about the research. Thrilled, and I hope that we have a good discussion.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to it for a while. We've had some great pre-discussions over the phone. So as we heat up the room, as JSOU President Ike Wilson likes to say, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your research in general and how you found yourself interested in civil military relations. Or in other words, what makes this such a passionate topic for you?
Yeah, thanks very much. So for me, the idea of civil military relations has been a huge topic my entire life. And the reason that I say that is because I am third generation military. And I think that that's important to note because I'm not only third generation military, I'm married to someone who's second generation military. And oh, by the way, the third generation is currently serving. So what we have going on is the warrior caste phenomenon. And that warrior caste phenomenon has been noted by scholars all over the place. And that is the fact that we have moved from what has been our idealized model of citizen soldiery. And 50 years into nearly 50 years into the all-volunteer force, we have moved into a pattern of citizen soldier. And I think that pattern has been exacerbated by the last 2 decades of war. And so for me, when you look at what's been going on in terms of all of the scholarship that's been proliferating with regard to civil military relations, the thing that has been so extraordinarily hard is the ability to survey serving military officers and NCOs themselves. And that's got there's a lot of reasons for that. We want to protect our service members from, lots of random academic surveys, not to mention the fact that we have survey fatigue in the military because of all of the surveys that are, taken for a whole pile of other different reasons. So As a result of the fact that in my ADHD of jobs, I serve as a visiting fellow at NDU. That gave me and my co-authors, Dr. Heidi Urban and Mr. Brett Swaney, the opportunity to do some research on civ-mil relations inside the castle, so to speak. And so from 2017 to 2020, we had the ability to do survey research on about 1,200 mid-grade to senior military officers, as well as West Point cadets. And that research allowed us to ask questions about their political views, their sacrifices, and their pride in service. And just to not hide the outcome, it confirmed a lot of past research indicating that service members are increasingly isolated. They also have a growing sense of personal exceptionalism. And the thing that we didn't expect to find, but we did, was it also indicated that the attitudes of military elites who are in minorities in terms of race, gender, and political views vary considerably at times from their majority peers. And for my co-authors and I, that raised questions about the degree of inclusivity within the ranks today. So I hope that gives a reasonable place for us to begin a conversation.
Absolutely. That's exactly where we wanted to start. And so I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on that. So looking at the findings of your citizen soldier research, and I read it, and there's a lot of really interesting empirical data that's coming out of there. In broad terms, so what is happening to this civil military gap over time? What do you think the causes are of it? And you use words like isolated and exceptionalism. So what do you think might be the long-term implications for this phenomenon that we're seeing?
Yeah, so it's definitely, yeah, that's a lot, right? So first of all, I don't want to pick on recruiters because recruiting is just an incredibly hard job. And so right now what I see and we look at is we see recruiters who take what I would consider to be an extraordinarily practical approach to it, which is you fish where the fish are. And as a result of that, what we have is we have a sort of reinforcing phenomenon associated with where the recruiting is coming from. I think it's 5 states, and a belt around the Southeast. And so we are not geographically representative of the country as a whole in terms of the way that we're recruiting and what our numbers look like. Also, we have a significant preponderance of white male conservatives who are coming into the military. And so as a result of that, what we have is we have a military that is becoming less representative as a whole of the United States of America. And I think that frankly, that is a dangerous path upon which we're going, specifically given our roots as being, part of American society. So when we are isolated, and we are isolated in multiple ways. We all, well, not we all, but many soldiers live on posts. Okay. And so you go to military schools when you're growing up. I went to military schools. You shop in the PX, you shop in the commissary. And so what you have is you have this isolation in which you've got soldiers who don't really spend, and their families who don't spend a lot of time with civilians, and more civilians who've actually never met a soldier. And so what you have developed, and we use the title secular saint very carefully when we brought this up, is that we have this reverence for military people that is almost instinctual right now. Thank you for your service. I don't know exactly what your service means, but thank you for it. And oh, by the way, 70% of the American public decides that we're heroes, regardless of what it is that we've actually done as far as serving. Simple act of service makes for reverence. And that reverence means that a dialogue or a true understanding starts to become very hard to get to. And it also makes us really believe our own press.
That's fascinating. I'm recalling a long time ago when I was an ODA detachment commander, we were in California doing a military freefall train up in order to deploy. And I had a chance to go to dinner with one of my best friends from like my middle school days and his parents. So they've known me since we were kids. And I remember the conversation that we were having at dinner, and his dad said something to the effect of, "You seem like a sharp guy, Joe. When are you going to get out of the Army and get a real job?" So yeah. I see that, and it goes both ways. And I can see where there's going to be some negative outcomes of that over time as this bifurcation just gets farther and farther down the road. And I remember trying to have a discussion about what I would be doing there with military freefall and how that has some sort of, applications for the battlefield. And I recall being disappointed because it was such an exciting field for me, and it was almost like disappointing to this other person that has known me for a long time and that I respected as an adult. So I definitely see what's going on there. Talk to me about how you chose your research subjects, specifically who you interviewed and how you got your data, because I think that goes a long way into interpreting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I will say right up front is that our data is sort of the West Point cadets are overrepresented. And let me begin with the idea of fishing where the fish are. We went out and we looked for anybody who was absolutely willing to allow us to be included in their data. So of course, National Defense University, since I was a professor there when we started the whole thing, was absolutely, yep, we'll get the we'll get the institutional review board together, and yes, you can go ahead and you can do the survey at National Defense University. From there, started calling around and to other universities, military PME institutions, asking whether they would do this. There is a lot of concern about opening up this sort of data, because the questions that we asked is, do you consider yourself liberal? Do you have pride in service? Do you think that the military should look like the service or the population that it protects? A lot of data. And oh, by the way, the first survey that we started doing came out right around the same time that the Trump administration came out or was being elected. And so there was a ton of sensitivity associated with this. And so we didn't get a lot of return calls, but I would like to say thank you very much to the United States Military Academy at West Point, who said, yes, absolutely, we can survey, to National Defense University, who said, yes, we can survey, and to the U.S. Army War College, who said, yes, we can survey. And so the data that we have is representative of those three institutions. So that gives us cadets, and that gives us seniors. And it's interesting looking at the variations in the responses between the cadets and the seniors in terms of their perception of service and their perception of the public they serve.
So as a West Point graduate myself, now we're starting to see a lot of even my classmates and some of my generations, women have been at West Point now for long enough where we're starting to see not just kids of West Point graduates, but kids of dual West Point graduate families. Right. And then there's also this other idea that we have out in the force where we talk about the military being, sometimes it's the so-called family business.
Yes.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that as we start talking about this isolated segment of this warrior caste?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we have this conversation that's like, well, the military is not different because there is a family business component here. Doctors have, kids who are doctors, and lawyers have kids who are lawyers. And so going into the family business, why is this actually, it's actually a reasonably common practice. You go into the military because it's what it's how you grew up. Frankly, that's my story. I would never probably have even thought about it if I hadn't grown up in a military family. But for me, the concern is that there is something fundamentally different about military service that is really at the heart of citizenship. And if you take that service associated with citizenship and you put it almost entirely on a caste, which is a part, what are you doing to the baseline understanding of what it is to be an American citizen and what the expectations are for being a citizen in the country? And so for me, that's an issue. Well, what are the sorts of things that you're talking about? Well, okay, couple of surveys that were out there with regard to whether or not we should put troops on the ground for ISIS. There were a lot of people, and I believe the survey was Pew Research Center. There was a preponderance of people out there who said, yes, absolutely, we should put troops on the ground. And these were not serving military people. But when asked whether or not they would serve themselves, the answer was overwhelmingly, oh, hell no, not me. That's what we have the military for. And so there is this idea that if you don't have to serve, You can be reverential of the military and at the same time not think so much about the sacrifices that they are actually undertaking, which means that you might actually put soldiers in harm's way more easily than if you have a broader burden of service across society. The second instance that I would talk to you about on that is, I think you probably remember when the whole SF issue blew up in Niger a couple of years ago, and we had President Trump made the comment, well, they knew what they signed up for. And so there was just this idea that somehow someone who had volunteered, their life is somehow worth something less than someone who has not volunteered. And that also is concerning, because I think, the decision as to whether or not to put troops in harm's way is one of the most difficult decisions that you can make politically. And if you can, absolve yourself of that, saying, well, they know what they signed up for, they're all volunteers, that changes the political calculus. And for me, frankly, that's concerning.
Yeah, I absolutely understand. And I want to explore that a little bit more, because now I'm thinking about our identity as a nation and how our identity of the nation, shaped by our perception of the military, could lead us into some problem areas. For instance, when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, I took an amazing class there about the American way of war. And when we got into the 19th century, we looked at the way that the United States was using the way that the covert operations as a way to try to achieve strategic ends, and how oftentimes it had some negative outcomes that happened years later, because the use of covert operations would sometimes be a shortcut to having really, really good policy. And I think as we look farther along the way in the development of the power of the United States military, and adding to that this division that we're talking about now, the potential for the US military to be thought of as perhaps a strategic shortcut is kind of there as well. Specifically, if speaking from certain members of the population, it's very little risk for me because I don't have to participate in it. So what are your thoughts on that, on maybe our identity of the United States military and how we're using it, with the idea of there could be some strategic shortcuts that might incentivize bad policy? I know it's a lot of questions, but
yeah, no,
I think we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a complicated subject, and the threads extend into so many different pieces that it's very hard to disaggregate them. For me, the idea, this is JSOU, so you guys all talk about it. It's the DIME model, D-I-M-E, and when I teach this at Georgetown, I talk about the DIME model, small d, small I, capital M, small e.
Right.
And so it's not just the military is not just the easy button in terms of, oh, we don't have to think too hard about it, but it's also from a resourcing perspective, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And so, I'm sure everybody has heard this. It's just this quote that gets used in PME so often. There's more service members in military bands than there are foreign service officers. I'm sure you guys have heard that like 100 times. It's true. And you've also heard the idea that it's true that, the foreign service or the State Department's budget is a rounding error for the DoD's budget. So we have, in fact, put ourselves in a position where, the resource, preponderance is so pointed towards the military, and then we have the volunteer force, and then we have the idea that, oh, well, it's not too hard to put soldiers out there. It has become the easy button. And frankly, I think that we need to really take a hard look at that and what it means, particularly, as we look at the 2018 National Defense Strategy and we look at, the return to great power competition. What does that mean? As we look at, adversaries with China and Russia, which are far less likely to be, conventional war sorts of situations. What does this mean? How do you put it all together? And civil military relations is a strand in there, but it's one strand in a really complicated Gordian knot.
Absolutely. With that, the perception of how strong the military is, how many people are doing this work is, it's hard for anyone to realize, even for a lot of people in the military. You look around and everybody around is serving with you. So it's sometimes hard to recognize how big or how not big the military is. And the idea that it's a blanket that you can throw over every problem can sometimes be problematic. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And then especially when we think about strategically, as we use the military, We have some successes. We have some incidents recently that most people would consider less than successful. What do you think the strategic implications are of our track record and how it affects our ability to move forward?
Yeah,
It's a tough one, I know, but
no, I knew we would get there.
yeah,
You know,
there.
it's really interesting. You know, because when you look at from 1980 forward, and you look at trust and confidence and overall appreciation for, you know, respect for institutions, the United States military is the only one that has actually continued to have, you know, extraordinarily strong public support, like 85% or higher all the way through there. Okay. So the United States military, even though the last 10 years or so have not been great, we still have incredible amounts of public support. And I wonder what that means, despite the fact that, you know, Afghanistan didn't turn out so well. You know, these wars have not been, you know, they haven't been in the W category for the United States of America. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how the public looks at us? And oh, by the way, what does it mean in terms of how we look at ourselves? Because we've got this idea of exceptionalism, and that specter. I don't want to overplay it and say, oh, we all think we're, you know, too good, because that's too simple. But at the same time, there is this idea, which is reasonably pervasive inside the military, in which, you know, I think it's what 60% of officers feel that, and this is not just recent, it's, you know, over probably the last 20, 25 years, think that, you know, in many ways, in terms of morals and in terms of our ethic, we're better than the society that we serve. You know, so what does that mean for us, and how do we bring that together? What should we do about the recent wars? I think at absolute minimum, we need to take a really, really hard look at ourselves. You know, and there have been, you know, retired 4-stars who've been calling for, hey, we need to do a really good AAR at the strategic level and figure out what's happened here and why we have done this. Because I don't think that the losses that we've been suffering have been the result of, you know, small unit tactics. I think we're extraordinarily good at that. I think it has to do with civ-mil relations at the highest level, at the strategic level. And that brings us to another point. That brings us to this idea of, you know, Huntington's objective control of the military, which seems to be, you know, the preferred model when we talk about it, and the preferred model for both the civilians and the military. Well, what does it mean? What is Huntington's objective control? Huntington's objective control basically says that there's a military sphere and that there is a political sphere. And so the politicians make the decision that we go to war, and it's like a relay race. You know, you hand off the baton, and then we go out, we fight the war, and when the war is over, you hand the baton back. And it's great because people who want to serve in an operational military want to go ahead and make the, you know, hey, I don't want to be constrained by political action. Hey, guess what, guys? When you read your Uncle Carl Clausewitz or when you read your Sun Tzu, right, it's all political action. And so this idea of the Huntingtonian version of this actually hamstrings both sides. But in many ways, both sides like it, because that gives, you know, the congressmen or the politicians, oh, well, the generals, they were the ones who screwed it up. And it gives the generals the opportunity to go, well, you know, if only those politicians had done the right thing. And so you get into this need for a much, much closer cooperation in warfare, and a much better understanding that warfare is an inherently political thing, and that you can't have just simple military operations out there. They all have to be for a purpose. And I think that we got so involved. This is my opinion, again, my opinion. We got so involved in fighting and maintaining, you know, the warfare, maintaining the status quo, that we really got lost in the idea of what winning means or what a good outcome means.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very, very, very important point. And when you think about it, you go to West Point and you look around, and all of the statues are for these great men that were great battlefield commanders, great war fighters. And so the idea of war, combat is, and what we use the military for does change over time. You have conversations with Americans and they're like, we need to take, you know, they say things like, we need to take the gloves off. And I'm like, I'm you know, and I'm asking them, well, in population centric warfare, what, you know, what exactly is that? What does that mean? What does war mean? And our education model, I'm afraid, and what I want to switch us to talking about education. our education model tends to be based on the idea of let's educate professional military folks for state-on-state warfare, so that one state military attacks another state's military, whichever one is the victorious party, the population immediately falls under this jurisdiction of the victor, and that's warfare. But I don't think that the type of conflicts we're getting in the post-World War II era are along those lines. So I think perhaps it's time for us to take another look at how we educate this professional force. And you mentioned professional military education earlier. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. You threw me a softball. You tossed me right in the briar patch. So I actually have some notes on this one. So
I'm glad you're ready.
All right. So I think today is what, somebody's having a birthday. Is it the United States Marine Corps that's having a birthday today? So let's go ahead. Let's have a shout out to the United States Marine Corps. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a look at Mao Zedong's On Guerrilla Warfare, which I was actually teaching last night. And I was rereading the introduction to Mao's On Guerrilla Warfare, which was published in 1937. And this is my Marine Corps thing. It had an introduction by Samuel Griffith, who was a Marine Corps Brigadier General and a PhD in Chinese military history. And Griffith noted in the introduction, in the United States, we go to considerable trouble to keep soldiers out of politics, and even more to keep the politics out of the soldiers. Guerrillas do exactly the opposite. They go to great lengths to make sure their men are politically educated and thoroughly aware of the issues at stake. And I found that a very interesting quote, specifically in terms of the types of wars that we've been fighting and the types of wars that we're likely to fight. And also in terms of the fallout from January 6th. So how do we start talking about this, and how do we start managing this in terms of the professional military education? So in one of my past lives, I was a professor at the Eisenhower School. Which is at National Defense University War College. And I would get, War College students in and we'd start talking about this. And it was almost like clockwork. I would have a newly minted colonel who would look at me when we start talking about the political aspects of warfare, and he or she, usually he, would say to me, "We don't do politics. The military doesn't do politics." And I think for those of you at JSOU, and in the special operations community, I don't think I'm going to get that sort of answer out of the special operations community. But I believe that there is that, I believe there is that bright line out there in which we understand, the military as a whole understands we don't do politics and somehow it's dirty and we don't get involved in it. And so I think that there needs to be a distinction made between the idea of politics and policy and the idea of political partisanship, because partisanship and politics have all become kind of an intertwined mess. And when we say we're not political, often what we're trying to say in the military is that we're not taking a partisan position. And that is a nuance that means a ton, because this idea of politics is shot, as I said, through everything that we do in the military. And I think that at the earliest levels, we need to start having these conversations. It was very interesting watching the chairman, General Milley, speak at the discussion on, his most recent testimony with regard to January 6th. And he says, look, I believe in, military subordination to civil authority. I've taken the oath of the Constitution and I will do that, with my dying breath, I will believe that, but at what point do we start educating our service members? With what this means. And I think that the reality of it is it's not an esoteric conversation anymore. This is something that is shot through everything that we do and will continue to be shot through everything that we do, from our conversations that we're having, God help us, at school board meetings, because we're allowed to go to those, through to what it is that we're doing in far-flung countries. And we need to have a very, very clear understanding of where the military fits inside the political spectrum and what subordination to civil authority means. The other thing that I'm going to put out there is, I think, going back to Wild Bill Donovan, when he was originally doing his recruiting, what was he looking for? He was looking for a PhD who could win a bar fight. I love that quote. Yep. I think the last 20 years of war have got us focusing on bar fights and less on PhDs. And so I think it's time to bring it back around, to bring the education piece back into it, to be able to start thinking through the ideas, and perhaps, nothing else, the withdrawal from Afghanistan might give us enough breathing room to start having some more of these conversations about what it is that we're getting ready for as far as the next thing goes.
I love what you're saying there, and especially the PhD and bar fight thing, because that really gets into the identity of the special operator, which we're going to continue to talk about here.
Yeah.
But what resonated with what you were saying just now is the idea of accountability and blame, both for military professionals, because it's easy to say, hey, I've sworn to do what I'm going to do. I'm doing the best I can. And I'm not saying that anyone's wrong in doing that, but that allows perceptions of different frames to take hold, depending on what your position is, of whether you support the military, don't support the military, whatever your thoughts on conflict are or politics. It allows for a bunch of different conversations to be had about the role that the military is having. And it allows for potentially there to be less accountability for senior leaders, because they can say, hey, it's not his fault, it's the politician's fault. And also for politicians to say, and there's some truth in this, if I'm a politician, I can only select courses of action that the military provides me.
Yes.
So I will listen to Americans have that conversation, and this really resonates with recent goings on in Afghanistan, right? The idea of whose fault it is. And it becomes, because there's not a unified vision in this, there's not a singular identity here, it creates a lot of opportunities for Americans in all flavors to be able to assign accountability and to assign blame, and for participants in this to avoid the accountability that comes with this. And I think that kind of speaks to the long-term strategic problems with this warrior caste system.
Yeah, and let's go back to the idea, okay, who's revered in society? What is the public opinion polling on Congress? I think it's single digits. You've seen the president's public approval, and I don't care whether we're talking about President Biden or we're talking about President Trump, or we can go back to President George W. Bush. They have all had low approval ratings, and the military has really, really high approval ratings. So it seems as though, to a large degree, the military has been getting a free pass. And because we're revered, we're heroes, we're secular saints, we're less understood and more superficially revered. Thank you for your service. Okay, and so if we're going to get the free pass, and then congressmen who are out there going, adopt your favorite service member, adopt your favorite general, and so as a result, they're not going to look at it too hard, because it's not good politics to dump on the military. So I think that leaves us to really being honest with ourselves and really taking a strong internal look at how we are teaching and how we are interacting, and what our conception of civil military relations at the strategic level are, and the way that we operate. And there's another piece in there that came up, because these questions, they're so broad. Another piece in there that came up in what you said. And it's this idea of the military and the civilians, extraordinarily earnestly speaking past one another in terms of policy decision making. Crisis X arises in country Y. The vaunted interagency or NSC process says, give us some options. And the military says, that depends upon what it is you want to accomplish. And they say, no, just give us some options. No, what do you want to accomplish? And it becomes a who's on first. And a lot of it has to do with, not understanding each other's realms, and not understanding what the other side is trying to accomplish. So the other thing for me, in terms of civil military relations, is for military officers to have broader opportunities to go to civilian education. And to meet those civilians who are going to eventually be those people who are at the National Security Council, and those people who are making those decisions. And for those people to meet the military officers and not have a caricatured view of them. So one of the other things that was very interesting to me when we were doing our survey, and this is with the senior crew, as you disaggregate it, really, really highly educated. I mean, 95% of the colonels had, multiple master's degrees, 9% had terminal degrees of one kind or another. Disaggregate that out farther. 85% of those degrees came from military PME institutions, which means that you can get multiple master's degrees without ever having gone to a civilian institution. And so we're insulating ourselves in that way, and we're isolating ourselves in that way too. And you end up, whether you want it or not, in an intellectual echo chamber.
Yeah, I actually had a chance to see that. My education started at West Point and then went to the Naval Postgraduate School. So I'm inside that world. And then my first shot at being educated with civilian peers was as a 40-year-old in a civilian academic institution. And it was very interesting, both for myself, seeing this world with everybody also being much younger, and then also their perceptions of what a military person is, particularly a Green Beret, because that has with it all of these other assumptions that come with it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a very interesting thing. I was fortunate I had another special operator that could attend with me, but had I not had that, I could see it being even a more lonely experience than it was. And there was no platform for us to have the enduring dialogue about kind of leveling the bubbles on the different perceptions here in what we're talking about, because it wasn't really discussed. It was just assumed that if I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and pursue this education with the assumptions that whatever that is the right way to go. So when we're talking about professional military education, and we're talking about there's different levels of it. So we have to be successful at the tactical level.
Absolutely.
Right. But we also know that tactical success does not have much of an impact on whether or not we're going to be strategically successful.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have to figure out a way for tactical education to segue into strategic education blended with a civilian perception, so that we don't continue to bifurcate this world, in order to get senior leaders, to end up with senior leaders that can bridge the civil military relations gap more effectively. What are your thoughts on how we do that? You mentioned more civil or more civilian education. How do you think we should go about following that guidance?
Yeah. So again, I've been retired now for, 4 years. So exactly 4 years. So some of the things I would say about this might be a little bit dated, and I apologize if they are. But as I was getting out, and I worked for General Odierno, may he rest in peace. And one of the things that General Odierno was extraordinary about was this idea of the fact that as budgets were coming down, he took an almost George Marshall-like view on things and said, as budgets are coming down, we need to make sure that education is going up. And so what and that was very much what General Marshall did back in the 1930s. And so what General O did was he put together a ton of quote unquote broadening programs. And these broadening programs were fascinating, and I thought that they were awesome, because it wasn't just for, colonels, because oftentimes I think, you give colonels it's too late. They're already fully formed human beings. These broadening programs, because I would go out and I would speak with them, they were, the E6, E7, E8, captain, major, CW2, CW3 level. And the one that I often worked at was out of the University of Louisville. And they would, they did basically 4 weeks of a TDY experience, which was for people at this level, which was essentially a classical education, a classic liberal education. They're reading Cicero, they're reading Epictetus, they're reading the founders. And what they're really looking at is that they're looking at the foundations of the profession. And frankly, particularly for special operators, you guys do a ton of school. You take a ton of opportunity to get educated in different ways. And I think that really just a couple of programs like this that just bring people in, not, oh, by the way, you're going to have to do a PCS and you're going to have to, basically be out of the community for a while, but just bring them in for a couple of weeks. And have a really focused conversation. And it was really interesting to me and extraordinarily heartening, because what we would do is we would have at graduation, the director of the program, and he was extremely well connected. I mean, he would bring in, like the director of the CIA, he would bring in, a Supreme Court justice, but everybody wants to talk to soldiers. Remember, we got an 86% approval rating, they would come in and they would talk. And at the final lunch, which was Thanksgiving dinner, everybody would stand up and say, "What is it that you give thanks for?" And this dinner was fascinating. And there was a soldier who had come from somewhere in Africa, I forget, and he stood up and he said, "I'm thankful for the country that took me in, and I am thankful for the opportunity here to understand the basis of service that undergirds my military profession. After 9 years, I never truly understood it." This is a very small investment, I think, that pays a massive opportunity. And so just to start to think about this as important, and to have some rigorous education, because I think that a lot of times we get past this idea, oh, well, they're junior, they're not going to get through it. No, they get through it. And they actually get really interested in it, because it underpins the value system, which frankly, everybody volunteered to support and defend. There's something there, let's talk about it. Let's educate it. And I think it is, right now on par with a lot of the other training and education that we do.
Absolutely. So when we look at the military through this lens, we can talk a little bit about the idea of the profession of arms,
Yeah.
which has been formalized to a certain point, or at least some really quality arguments have been made over the past 70 years or so, from the mid-19th century post-war era, about the idea of a profession of arms, in the same way that the medical profession is a profession and legal professions and so on. Using the literature of Huntington, Abbott, Janowitz, and Hackett, if we talk about the profession of arms in that respect, is there any thoughts on how professionalizing special operations might help with special operators bridging that gap between the idea of a military identity rooted towards war and a military identity rooted towards that gray zone? Because we spoke earlier that there's two separate things, and perhaps that confusion is causing a lot of the problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting, because before you guys talked to me about the idea of a special operations professional identity, I hadn't really considered it before. I thought, oh, it's specifically associated with civil military relations. This is something that all military officers and all military NCOs need to understand, and I stand by that. But I think it's even more critical now that I've thought about it, with regard to the special forces and the special operators. And the reason for that is because your mission set is so much more inherently political. You get back to Kennan's idea of political warfare. You look at your mission sets, whether they're FID or whether they're UW. There's politics associated with those, and the rule sets are different. Whereas there is, I don't want to say there's something easy about, basically, okay, we're going to do an NTC rotation and it's going to be combined arms maneuver, but there's a right and a wrong, and it either works or it doesn't. There is a ton of used gray zone. There is a ton more fluidity associated with what success and failure looks like in these political missions. And so for special operators, I think understanding and having a good solidified professional military ethic to which they can relate and touch is incredibly important. And I think that it's not a secret that there have been some problems in the special operations community over the last, with 20 years of warfare. I don't think that's to be unexpected. You guys have been extraordinarily busy. But at the same time, what you all have been doing has made it probably a little bit easier to simply get lost in all of the nuance and to get lost in all of the gray. And so for me, I think it's time to bring it back to first principles. And I think it's time to do exactly what you're doing, which is to create a curriculum for the professional military ethic and for the profession of SOF. So yeah, I applaud what you're doing.
Fantastic feedback. I appreciate it. So as we're doing that, and I think I told you before, Dr. Tony Pfaff has been collaborating with us on that, and he's helped me out in a great deal exploring that. And what we've come up with are 5 factors based on the literature, a little bit of Huntington, Abbott, Janowitz, and all of the others. So we're looking at the jurisdictional uniqueness of special operations, the implicit expert knowledge, autonomy, certification, and then that soft specific professional ethic. Because Tony helped frame this argument that a lot of the ethical issues that special operations are seeing are actually symptoms of there being a professionalization issue. And that if we address the professionalization issue, then the soft professional ethic that comes with it should begin to address some of the problems. Not that it's a cure-all, but it's a foundational framework for us to start. As an expert in civil military relations, do you think we're on the right track with those factors? If there, and if so, if there's something missing, is there something missing? And how do you think that might help shape the future of SOF as we get more and more into these gray zone environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely on the right track, and our conversations that we've been having have made me go back and look at, the idea of what a profession is, and what the professionalism, what professional ethic consists of, and the things that I kind of came out with as I was looking at it, differentiation of profession, obviously the high level skill set, the certification that comes with professionalism, and then the idea that somehow it is in greater service of the common good. Yes, SOF is definitely a profession. So when I came to it and I was thinking about it, and this is a question for you because I get to ask a question.
Awesome.
Now, is when you get to the certification and you look at this, obviously, there is a ton of certification that is necessary, whether you're getting your Ranger tab or whether you're getting your, Special Forces tab, or whether you're becoming, an Navy SEAL or whatever. Is there any certification associated with understanding the professional ethic? And do you manage that? Do you put that in to any of the certification?
So I've been trying to explore that myself.
Mm-hmm.
And my initial thoughts are like my gut feeling, so to speak, was like, yes, we need ethics in special operations. We need SOF specific ethics.
Yeah.
So I had that conversation with a lot of people I'm close to, and some of my colleagues have expanded it even into their networks. And the results have been kind of mixed.
Okay.
And I introduced the topic almost initially, and starting about 2 years ago, with the expectation that my friends and colleagues were going to be like, yeah, absolutely, Joe. I understand exactly what you're saying. And one of the first conversations I got with a former roommate at West Point, who's a brigade commander now, he sat there for a second and was like, I'm not buying it.
Okay.
And I was like, yeah, okay. And he's like, I don't understand how you think that ethics in special operations is different than anywhere else. And so I found that since then, I thought what I thought was an easy argument to lay out wasn't as universally recognized as I had hoped. So then I found that my co-author Carrie and I, as we write some of the things and trying to lay that out, it's been very difficult because we're trying to do that in a way that has meaning, where people see it and recognize it as something that has value, instead of being like, special operations are just trying to go on their own, or trying to do something that's not necessary. And it's been challenging. It's been challenging to frame it in exactly the right way. But as we talked about the other day, there's certain things that special operators have to do while operating in this gray zone as part of this fourth age of special operations that are simply just facts. And one of the things is, and it's a simple question, but if you ask somebody, given the say the ethical codes that the big military learns are oftentimes binary. They're binary codes. Everything's either right or wrong. For example, the cadet the cadet honor code at West Point is, you will not lie, cheat, or steal. And it's kind of implied ever. You will not lie, cheat, or steal ever, almost to the point where as a professional, even if it costs you your life, right? Like the honor, our level of honor is so high. Mm-hmm. However, there's certain types of operations that you'll find yourself in the gray zone, where the need to protect yourself through deceptive language, which you could call lying, is absolutely necessary. There's no way that anybody could work under any kind of cover or in a lot of the complex areas that special operators tend to deal with more than others, where those kind of skills aren't necessary. So then, from a theoretical standpoint, once you pulled somebody out of the binary world, if we haven't provided an ethical code that can travel out of the binary world into the gray world, then whether or not that person succeeds or fails is kind of our fault, because we have not provided
I agree.
an ethical code to fill that gap. So we've been working on trying to fill that gap, but it's very challenging because you have to have this conversation almost one-on-one all the time in order for folks to understand it. And once you do, you can convert people pretty quickly, but it's a conversation that doesn't seem to be as common in the world as I would like. So hopefully just this conversation now, and as people watch, it'll help us start to resonate with the idea of special operations professionals do require a little bit different education in ethics to really be able to do that job. And if we're not providing soft specific ethical education as senior leaders, then we're doing our profession a disservice, and we have an obligation to fix that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because things are starting to kind of circulate in the back of my head. And so these are half-formed thoughts, and I apologize for them up front if they don't come up exactly right. But it's funny because like the president of JSOU, Dr. Wilson, I spent about 20 years as an Army 59 strategist. Okay. And it's interesting because my assignments, like so many other people's assignments, were split, almost evenly between Washington, D.C. and then, out somewhere in the field. And whenever I was out somewhere in the field, I would find myself in the company of sort of the same cast of characters, which is a very different cast of characters than I found myself in Washington, D.C. And that cast of characters were special operators, foreign area officers, 59s, strategists, and people who represented intelligence agencies. And it almost got to the point where, like, on my third overseas assignment, I'm looking around, I'm like, and here I am in the same room with, Bob, Bill, Joe, and Jim again, doing, interesting things. What is it about these specialties that keep kind of, clinging together in certain situations? Well, the mission set is different. It's complex. It is almost invariably strategic. And oh, by the way, the right answer is ambiguous. And it might not take you down the path of grace all the time. Okay, so the question then becomes, what is it about these crews that come together that in very certain circumstances have very similar kinds of mandates? And what are we doing to educate them in a way that allows them to think more broadly and widely about these issues? And so for me, I'm like, you actually do have some fellow travelers, 59s, 48s, and certain operators out of the intelligence agencies, and I think it might be useful to actually start having some conversations with other communities and start going, hey, you know what, you're not actually alone. Although we've all been acting like we are alone for a very long time. And maybe there's some strength together to think through some of this stuff.
I agree. And I think that's what the Think JSOU series is about, is putting us in realistic conversations with those fellow travelers. And also having to recognize that, hey, we all get classic military education, and that when you get into the special operations world, we have to possibly come to the realization, the hard realization, that we need something different. We need an educational process that's different for what we do, because the classic military education, professional training is necessary, but not sufficient. Because some of the other fellow travelers, especially when you look at the intelligence community, is they're like, hey, we start out knowing that. We start out knowing that what we do is different. So we're not trying to pretend to be one thing and then to another. So with that, I want to add another, what I think is an interesting gap in this professional military training, and that's leadership training. So I go back to my first days at West Point, which is essentially inserting yourself into a great man leadership scenario where everybody that's there has been there longer than you, they're better than you, and you should follow them. And that's pretty much how the military does leadership. I'm more experienced than you, you're going to follow me. And same thing with the infantry, follow me statute. It's essentially, I'm there, I'm highly trained, you should respect me, follow me. So for special operators, and you know, I'm a former SF officer and a leadership scholar, so I like to look at these things through a unique lens. So when I look at what leadership skills are necessary to be a soft leader, it's a little bit different, because I can't show up in a developing country, which is often going to be immersed in a tribal society, and say, hey, I'm better than you, follow me. I'm getting off a helicopter with equipment that makes me almost as foreign as a space alien, with the expectations that the folks I'm trying to lead are just going to jump up and be like, oh, thank goodness you're here, let's go. And then I also think about some of the way that we frame these gray zone missions. We use very specific language in these gray zone missions. Again, leadership scholar lens. So we like to say things like, we're there to train, advise, assist, accompany. We use all of these words to really, really neck down exactly what we're doing, but we never want to say lead.
Mm-hmm.
So again, going back to the idea of accountability, I feel like when we say all of those words, leave out lead, we leave out leadership, we're taking away the implications on our end that we're responsible for everything that who we're leading that we do or fail to do. So I think we lose that, and we leave out the human interaction that occurs in relational leadership. So I think that gap there is something that we need to learn. So I think the leadership education of special operators, along with the professional ethic, also needs to recognize that we need to learn not only how to lead other service members in combat, but we also need to learn how to lead micro-level partner forces, and as well as positively influence micro-level populations, because that's where we're going to have that competitive edge. That's where we're going to be in an environment that might be foreign to many of the rest of the professional military, and also where we're going to find those fellow travelers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling at you, you know, because the thing that's coming in my head right now is I'm like, it's 2012. I'm in a room in the Pentagon having very, you know, outspoken conversations about the possibility of incorporating a seventh warfighting function.
Yeah.
You know, and everything you just said, and I think it was incredibly well said, seems to be this idea of like, well, what's missing? Well, what's missing is this thing, you know, and what does this thing mean? Well, you know, we necked it down to this idea of leadership through influence, but we don't like the word influence because influence means something. You know, it makes us kind of worried, you know, and then we were all in the human domain space. You know, and whether or not the human domain is the right answer. Is it the human domain warfare? We get into the war amongst the people piece, but you know, it wouldn't keep coming up if it weren't fundamentally different. And you know, and I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think that the answer is, and it's not just SF, although it definitely is SF.
Right.
You know, this is one of the things that we talked about with regard to the SFABs. You know, the security force assistance crews that are going out. You know, it is a mindset shift that is required in order to effectively execute in those environments. You know, how do you do this? I mean, I spent a year in Jerusalem doing security force assistance for the Palestinians. You know, and it was very interesting because Army, you know, there were former brigade commanders who were, you know, straight infantry. We had some former SF people, you know, we had some, you know, some strategists, we had some FAOs, and it was almost like a leadership lab, watching the different ways in which people just immediately and automatically went to interact with their counterparts, you know, and there is a different leadership method that is absolutely required. And I think that you know, I go back to I don't know if it was John Noggle who said it, but he's the one resonating in the back of my head. You know, we're talking about the graduate level of warfare right here, you know, and I'm like, yes, we are. We're talking about it. So we do need to do something different, and I think you're absolutely on it. And the other you know, analogy that I'll toss out that I use all the time is this is jazz. You know, what you learn at West Point is classical music. It's got rhythm, it's got meter, it's got rules. What you're doing in SF is more improvisational. And then once you learn those rules really well, you have to be taught a little bit about kind of, okay, here's sort of how it works. And now when you sort of got it, you got to figure out how to play with the band that you've been given. And so it is harder. And it will take longer, and some people are naturally better at it. But yeah, it's an endeavor that absolutely needs to be undertaken. Soft should be Iron Maiden. Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is funny. I want to get to a comment that Ben, I believe it's Ben Ordaway, posted on here about why there needs to be a separate code, because we talked a little bit about that, and it seems to be an interesting friction point. Why a separate code? Why not just better assessment and selection? And my last job when I was in uniform was the director of Special Forces Proponency. So I found that as we were looking at how to build the special operator we need, it was very, very easy. It was almost the easy button to blame the selection process and to say, oh, we need to find a better way to select. It always goes back to, I found that we were biased by always going back and saying, if something goes wrong, it must be because we're not selecting the right people. However, if we're going to talk about this as a separate profession and even open up our minds to the idea that this profession requires a different education system, then instead of going to the easy button and saying, let's focus on assessment and selection, let's assume that we're selecting good people and that we need to find a way to provide effective, meaningful, continuing education, continuing professional military education along the way to address the frictions of the real world, the realities of the environments that we're putting them in, because we have to recognize them for what they are, not for what we want them to be.
Yes.
And, we've talked a little bit about that. So the larger vehicle is set up to fight state-on-state warfares. The special operations world is set up to address a whole different thing. And I don't think there's any hazard in providing an education that's specifically oriented to the folks that are going to be always a little bit different.
Yeah. So I would frame it this way. And so one of the other go-tos that I think what we're talking about is an and, not an or. When I look at the current environment and I look at, what is it that the United States military has to be prepared to do? I call it the problem of and, because the conventional warfare mission has not gone away. However, cyber is rising, and counterinsurgency is rising, and hybrid is rising, and oh, by the way, tactical nuclear, right? And you guys, I say you guys, Special Operations Forces, you guys have one of the largest sets of conjunctive ands out there in your mission set. So I don't understand why the education wouldn't also include a ton of ands. Okay, so yes, you should understand what conventional military codes of ethics are.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should understand what the conventional codes of ethics are. And now, it's like getting another belt and you need to understand the form here, and you need to understand the form here, because this is all additive. And you all have a very hard mission set, and it requires a ton of nuance. So yes, I don't think the idea that the PhD who won the bar fight was I think it was snarkily said, but I think that it was incredibly earnestly meant. There is a ton of education required to do what you guys do well.
Obviously I agree. I'm biased, of course. But
I was going to say we're having a serious agreement here.
It's interesting to see how long it takes to go all around in this conversation to get to that point, so that everyone can go, okay, I get it. Because it's very easy to have a one-size-fits-all education. And perhaps it's time for us to take a look at it and say, if we're as good at this, as we think we are, then probably we need to take a look in the mirror. And if that's the case, then maybe we need to educate ourselves differently, so that we don't have some of these failures that we have to pretend like we're not seeing. Yeah. And even when we put some of our former senior leaders from the last 2 decades out there, we're seeing a lot of feedback about how to lead like this person, great leadership lessons. And the fact is sometimes we also have to say, where did we go wrong and what would you have done better? What lessons do we need to learn? What are those hard lessons? Let's take a real look at that. And in another area, and I wouldn't do our audience a service if I didn't get into some of the audience questions. So I'm looking there. One of them is bringing up the race inequality issues in special operations. And I think that ties directly to my comment earlier about we're trained to lead Americans, other Americans, but yet where we go to do this leadership, where we work, is in developing countries.
I agree. I agree. I mean, and this goes back to the paper that we began talking about. You know, and as I said, one of the things that was very interesting to me that my co-authors and I did not expect to find was a distinct difference regarding pride in service and the feeling that the military should represent you know, the cross section of the United States of America, depending upon what your political leaning was and what your race was, and to a degree what your gender was. And although we found that you know, overwhelmingly there was pride in service, that pride in service actually was a couple orders of magnitude lower if you happen to be African American. And that is a disturbing idea. You know, what does that mean? You know, and oh, by the way, if you were female or if you were liberal, which made you a minority in all the survey questions, you also had a stronger belief that there should be pride in service. You know, and we've kind of gone, oh, why, you know, but we think it might be due to the fact that the experience of the minority military elites may vary considerably from their majority peers. And this raises questions about the degree of inclusivity or even outright discrimination and harassment inside the ranks. It's hard to be a minority, however you determine that. And the question then becomes, you know, what is it that we do with regard to it? I mean, it is a consistent, continuing problem. You know, as a woman, I was astonished the first year I did the survey, which was 2016, 2017. Because my first set of survey questions, and we sent this out to National Defense University, was to uniformed service member students at NDU. And when I got it back, I did not have a statistically significant sample of women. And I was like, what do you mean? There's women all over the place. Well, when I discounted the foreign service officers and the Homeland Security officers and the intelligence agency people, I realized that the female uniformed population at NDU was only 6%. That is very, very, very low. You know, and I barely had a statistically significant sample of racial minority. And the number was even just a little bit higher. So what does that say, given that NDU produces, you know, the next 20 years, you know, senior leaders? It says that probably for the next 15 years or so, their senior leaders are going to continue to be white male and overwhelmingly self-identifying as conservative. Right. So that's another issue associated with the civil military gap, which is, I think, you know, very evident within the special operations community.
I agree. And I think it's going to be more pronounced when you take that person who's going to represent our senior leadership and you make them a special operator and you put them down in the environment where they're going to be using all of these skills in that developing country, that typical tribal society.
Yes.
And then we're going to find that gap widening. And it's interesting because I've been doing a little bit of work on this in the last year or so, and trying to have these conversations with active special operators. There's a little bit of a tendency for people to be defensive because it's like, hey, I work with whoever's here. It's just that there's not a lot of minorities on my team, but if there are, I don't mind and I'll work with them. And I understand that. But in order for us to learn the next lessons, in order for us to increase the value of this profession, I think we need to look past being defensive and start thinking about what type of signals are we even subconsciously putting out to the world that are making the inclusion aspect of special operations a profession that people are less likely to veer to if they do come from minorities.
Yeah.
And there's something there that we might not be seeing, and it's worth looking into, because when we look at the data shows that increased diversity improves your ability to solve complex problems.
Yes.
And if everybody nods when we say, hey, we're operating in a world that's highly complex, that's compounded, that is more dynamic than anything that anyone else is doing. Everybody's like, yes, I agree. No special operators like, no, that's not true. But then when we introduce the idea of diversity, then everyone's like, well, wait a second. And it's like, if we're seeing that increased diversity is going to contribute directly to our ability to deal with these environments that we're proud of, then it's worth us taking a look at how we might be signaling to the world that inclusion is not a priority of special operations.
I mean, I don't really have anything to add because I tend to agree, and you know this far better than I do.
Well, it goes back to what you said at the very beginning, in my opinion, which is recruiters, which do the best job they can, and it is a very difficult job.
Hard job.
They fish where the fish are. And so maybe it's time for us to take a look, not necessarily going back to assessment and selection as somebody was recommended, but let's go back to the very beginning of the source where we're finding people off of the street. What are we signaling to Americans that get them into the military in the first place? And how might we offer opportunities, inclusion opportunities for minorities, so that we'll have more intellectual capital to deal with these problems? And it might mean that we have to relook some of the long-standing historical recruiting models.
Oh, no, I agree with you. I think, it's time to start fishing in areas where the fish are just not biting quite as hard. The other thing out there that I think is also very interesting is, I think it would be very useful to do some really strong exit surveys on the people who leave the military. And the people who leave the military after their first enlistment or after their initial commitment when they get commissioned, because the question is, why if we start at this number, by the time we get to the level of 06, we're actually looking at, something that is 94% white male. Why are people leaving when they're leaving? And I think that could actually be incredibly illuminating as well.
I'm trying to look at some of the questions coming up. So I want to give everyone a chance to interact with you. So someone has a question here that says, as a civilian, I'm more concerned about military approval or disapproval of military by rank. We're seeing a great division in the ranks between those who do and do not support the generals and the top brass. I wonder what, and this is to both of us, what we think about that, or have we seen this in our circles, that this idea that leaders who are highly educated, critical thinkers are being dismissed as part of the educated elite or the political establishment? Does this make service members more wary of becoming part of that echelon of the highly professionally educated?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't know whether or not I'm going to answer your question directly, but I'm gonna take it where I think you're going. And for me, pieces of it have to do with the fact that society as a whole, and the politicians on both sides have politicized generals. Okay, and the generals have allowed themselves to become politicized. 40 years ago, you didn't see that people were lining up in presidential elections to get generals on their sides. And now you see it. And the issue is, I think, that, and having talked to a fair number of general officers, what I'm about to say is not universally agreed upon. It is time for general officers to recognize that once they ascend to that rank of seniority, they will forever be known as general. The idea that they are a retired general, the idea that they are a non-serving general, that is not something that civilians they distinguish. Now, if they want to go into a career in politics and basically say, like General Clark did, and say, you know what, I'm running for president. Well, okay, they've made that cross. Okay, they've crossed over. They're not politicians, and that's okay. But this idea that you're going to use your rank in order to push for, one political party or another, it does no good for the system. It does no good for the system at all. And so again, I get to be bipartisanly, cranky about this, because when General Mattis and General Kelly and General McMaster went into the Trump administration, on the one hand, I'm kind of like, oh, thank God. And on the other hand, I'm like, no, this shouldn't be, and then we turned around and with the Biden administration, we brought in General Austin as the Secretary of Defense. Why do we feel that we do not have completely capable civilians in order to run the Department of Defense when you have a system which is predicated upon civilian control of the military? So I think that erosion that we're seeing is going on all over the place. And I think that contribution is being made by retired generals themselves, as well as by politicians. And so this greater erosion is leading to what I think your question was about.
Right. And to take my perspective on Joan's question there, I'm going to look at it a little bit differently and think about, there's this idea that sometimes when an event happens and certain people, especially in special operations, are identified as having done something wrong, a lot of times there's a disagreement on the degree to which that person has done something bad. And you'll see it where a special operator does some sort of activity, some sort of behavior, and perhaps they're being prosecuted, and even political figures will be like, hey, we trained this person to do this and we're punishing them for what they're supposed to be doing, or how can we punish someone who's just out there trying to do the right thing? And that speaks to the idea that in the special operations profession, we have to have an educational system that trains us to behave within the complexity that we're actually going to operate. So just because it might look like to an outsider that I'm doing the right thing, we inside the profession, if we recognize that we've given you the right education, we've given you the right training, and we understand and respect the norms that go into the realities of the environment, then we also have the ability at that point, if we do our homework ahead of time, to say, and now we're going to punish you because you didn't behave in a manner that's commensurate with what we think this profession is about. And I think that that's part of it. So when you see the world kind of jumping on both sides of an argument about a special operator's activities to say, how could we possibly do that? Or they, the military elites are going after this person for doing their job. It speaks to the inherent issues with the need to professionalize the special operations so that we can have a better sense of who's right and who's wrong in the complex world, because just describing it, even using facts, might not really get there. So to me, it goes back to, again, more of a call to professionalize special operations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm thinking now, I was in a room like years ago at the start of like the global war on terrorism, and we were having some relatively esoteric conversations, and the senior person in the room said, okay, everybody stop. Like, torture is bad, period. Genocide is bad, period. Would anyone like to defend either one of those practices? And everyone in the room stopped. And he's like, I think we can all agree on this. Now, having said that, let's continue the conversation and continue where we are and what it is that is going on here. But there's so many opportunities to get lost in the nuance of the moment. And to recognize that, well, what about this situation and this situation? Okay, all right, we need to take a look at it. But let's not get lost. Killing children for sport is bad. Yes, killing children for, and so, yeah, there's a lot of complexity, and that there's a lot of gray area out there, but there are just certain things out there that you don't condone. And we need to stop and hit those touchstones and say, all right, anyone disagree with this, generally speaking, and we understand that there are circumstances. Yeah, okay. And by not having those conversations, in a way where people can really talk it through, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Absolutely, I agree. I want to make sure that I catch some of the feedback that's coming into the chat here. And there's two issues that came out of our conversation so far. One is related to the diversity side, and the other one was are touching on soft ethics. So I want to address those really quickly. And so somebody wrote about they disagree and that there's always a concern that that the discussion about diversity and inclusion will incentivize us to cater. That's the word used here, but yeah, to forcefully go out and recruit minorities for the sake of recruiting minorities. And I want to say that the approach that I want to take with that is that that's not what I'm recommending we're doing. What I'm recommending we're doing is, one, just recognizing the value that diverse perspectives play in how successful special operations are. So just recognizing that value and saying, yes, I do recognize the value. And then two, making sure that we are, or recognizing that we're potentially putting out signals that keep minorities from joining special operations when they should. Not about going out and recruiting minorities for minority's sake, but making sure that we eliminate any signals that we're putting out to the world that say, hey, inclusion does not include you. So that's really what it is. It's eliminating whatever biases we're putting out there to the world, and then also making sure that we're recognizing the value that increased diversity brings. And I think those are a positive. Any thoughts on that, Susan?
Yeah, so let's go back to the idea of the warrior caste. Okay, so what we've got is we've got this generational phenomenon, and that generational phenomenon is largely white. Not entirely, but largely white. And oh, by the way, women, generally speaking, don't go, I'm not sure what I want to be when I grow up. Well, let me join the military. I never would have even thought twice about it if I hadn't been part of a military family. Okay, so I think that we need to do a better job of sort of demystifying what is actually involved in a career in the military, and making it more appealing to a broader cross section of America. Because I think the problem set, or part of the problem set, is the fact that we are so insular or inbred, or whatever it is that you want to call it, that we keep reproducing ourselves generation after generation. As I said, both my family and my husband's family are 3 generations strong and going. Okay, well, that's all right, but what if we keep isolating ourselves from the broader community? That's my thought.
Very, very valuable thoughts. So I want to address the other hanging chad that's out there. And so somebody was talking about the idea of soft specific ethics. And this is a very common perception when I have these conversations in the world. I worry that carving out a special set of ethics will only exacerbate the existing sense of entitlement. And I believe they're talking about entitlement in special operations. Yeah. So I'll answer that real quickly and then hand the ball over to you. But my thoughts were that are, if you're going to be afraid of something, I get it, that's something to be afraid of. But I'm reframing it and saying the fear, though, is knowing that we're intentionally, deliberately, by design, putting people in environments where a binary ethical code is necessary but not sufficient for what they're doing. That by failing to have an ethical code specifically oriented to special operations, we're putting them in an environment where they're not going to have the tools that they need to survive. That's something we should be afraid of, as opposed to being afraid that the existence of that code will create a sense of entitlement. A true professional ethos based on the requirements of special operators should not have the bad effect of increasing entitlement. It should be done in a way that increases the capability so that we don't have to be entitled. That's my approach for it. So instead of being afraid of one thing, I'm saying let's be afraid of the other. Let's be afraid of not having it as opposed to what would go wrong if we have it, and just create one that makes sense.
No, I absolutely agree with you. The other thing that I've often had the conversation about is, all right, you've done well, you're a special operator, or you've done well, you've made colonel, or you've done well, you've made general, or whatever it is, congratulations, you're awesome. Whatever it is you've done, I think one of the things that we have to be incredibly aware of is the need for humility, regardless of what it is that we're doing. And I feel like so often when I'm talking with, groups of military, that idea of humility it gets buried, and that there is that specter of exceptionalism out there. And that's one of the major conclusions of the paper. It's not rampant, but it does exist. And I think that exceptionalism actually does in fact to a degree spring from this sense of isolation. The fact that we are separate and apart. Well, okay, we're separate and apart. Why? Well, because we're better. Okay, yeah, that works. That's a nice explanation. So why don't we come back to the idea of servants and service and the inherent humility associated? And I believe if that is the sort of ethos that underpins that professional ethic, you will probably be able to survive the specter of this, oh boy, let me entitle myself more. Because frankly, it's a fair concern, and it is out there.
I think that's fantastic. And I will only add to that, that in agreeing with you, I think we need to also take that to the next level, which is taking that idea of service all the way down to the micro level with our micro level partner forces and populations. Yeah. That level of service, when we inject ourselves into someone else's world, we have that same obligation to provide quality leadership. We can call it train, advise, assist, accompany, all of those other words. It's still leadership. It's still human connection, and they deserve the same high level of leadership. So taking what you said, and I'm just pushing it all the way down to the special operators, and let's build an ethos around that.
Agreed.
All right, I think we've gone for quite a while. So Dr. Bryant, thank you again for sharing your time today. And I would like to remind the audience that if you found our discussion enlightening, and I hope you did, that I encourage you to take a look at our curriculum and some of our course dates at the JSOU public webpage, and also take time to explore some of our press publications and similar topics. So for feedback on Think JSOU, feel free to check out our social media posts and some of the things that John Bird mentioned at the beginning. And remember that this series was brought to you by the Strategic Studies Department of the Joint Special Operations University. So thank you all for listening, and thank you very much, Susan Bryant.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.